Because he's part of the Three Rivers Archaeological Association, another group that meets here. And he talked to me at that time, or somebody introduced me to him and said that he could tell us a lot about the explorations of De Soto in Arkansas. I remember the old song, Beautiful Arkansas, where we used to sing about that. You may not have. I'm older than a lot of you, but anyway. Roy is a life member of the Arkansas Archeological Society, president-elect of Arkansas Master Naturalists Incorporated, and a member of Ozark Highlands Trail Association and Arkansas Trails Council. Graduate of Florida State and the School of Banking of the South. He worked for 34 years with the U.S. Comptroller of the Currency in Atlanta, London, Washington, and New York, and lives over in Lakeview. So, Roy, come on and tell us what you've got to tell us. I'll get out of your way here.
I'll just move my computer. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the De Soto Entrada. De Soto was a fascinating man. I didn't say a nice man. In fact, we can't discuss De Soto without touching for a few minutes on some of the violence. But he was an amazing individual and an amazing explorer. And he was the first European to set foot in Arkansas. But he very nearly changed history. If you turn back the clock 500 years, you would have thought that we here in Arkansas, United States, would be speaking Spanish and not English. But for a few decisions that De Soto made, we might very well be speaking Spanish. The story starts in 1492, when Columbus discovered the New World. He started a gold rush. Columbus discovered the Indians in the Indies had gold. He went back to Spain. He said these natives, these Indians have gold, and they would make, they're the most docile, peaceful people you've ever met. Columbus started a gold rush. He's actually a pretty decent man, but he started a gold rush. And a gold rush attracts the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there were plenty of bad and ugly. Between 30 and 40% of the first colonists that Columbus brought to the New World were criminals. Some of them were murderers released from prison so that they could go to the New World to colonize the Indies. But this gold rush started the Spanish century, the 16th century. From 1492 to 1588, when the Spanish Armada was destroyed, invading England, was the Spanish century. Spain was an enormously wealthy superpower, derived from a whole river of silver that flowed out of Peru and Mexico, and spices from the Philippines flowing back to Spain. The Spanish spread like wildfire through Central America, the Caribbean, South America. Within 70 years, there were Spanish colonies from the Gulf of California all the way to Cape Horn. 50 years after Columbus discovered the Indies, 50 years after that, some Spaniards in Peru, on the western side of South America, went down the Andes into the jungle to establish a cinnamon plantation. They got in a boat, went looking for some food, got carried down the river through the jungle. They floated all the way down the Amazon River to the Atlantic Ocean, made their way up the Atlantic Ocean to Venezuela. 50 years after Columbus. Now think about that for a moment. It would be 3 centuries before Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri River and out to the Pacific. So 50 years after Columbus, the Spaniards had spread all through South America. Now, within 10 years after Columbus, 1492, they knew about North America. The first Spaniards in North America are anonymous slave traders. The Spaniards in the Caribbean put the Indians to work in the mines. They needed slaves. They worked them to death. So Spaniards would sail their ships up to the coast of America, which they called La Florida, land of flowers. They would raid the villages or purchase captive Indians, drag them off to their ships in chains. So this slave trade in North America within 10 years of Columbus' discovery created a harvest of bitterness and enmity that would last for many decades. You can imagine how the Indians of North America viewed Europeans. Now, within about 20 years of Columbus' discovery, the Spaniards had pretty much mastered Central America, South America. They turned their eyes on North America. The King of Spain would send 7 conquistadors to North America. He wanted to make North America a Spanish colony. Now, they had 3 objectives. They had 3 objectives in North America. They wanted North America very badly for 3 reasons. One is they wanted to beat the French. The French were beginning to explore. The Spanish wanted North America before the French could get there. Secondly, they believed there was a northwest passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific through North America. They wanted to find it. But thirdly, the Spanish wanted to build a silver road from Mexico to South Carolina. It would be like the Silk Road in Asia. The Spaniards were hauling huge amounts of silver and spices through the Gulf of Mexico, but many of their galleons sank. They hit reefs, storms, hurricanes, and pirates. They were sick of losing their treasures in the Gulf of Mexico, so they sent these conquistadors, and one of their missions was to build this silver and spice road from Mexico to South Carolina. It wasn't such a crazy idea. Later, they would develop the Santa Fe Trail and El Camino Real, basically a road from New Mexico to Mexico City and Kansas and the Great Plains. So they began sending conquistadors to North America. Now listen, the first 4 of the 7 conquistadors, the first 4 all died. Now let's talk about conquistador number 3 before we get to De Soto. That's him on the left. His name is Narváez. Narváez only had one eye, and the way he lost his eye was about 10 years earlier. He was sent to Mexico to arrest Cortez. Remember Cortez? He conquered the Aztecs. Narváez was sent to arrest Cortez and cut his head off. Narváez arrived in Mexico and was told Cortez is hundreds of miles away, so Narváez went to sleep in a coastal fort built by Cortez, and while he was asleep, Cortez and his men raided the fort. There was a sword fight, stabbed out Narváez's eye, and threw him in prison for about 3 years. Cortez finished conquering the Aztecs. Now, the King of Spain should have learned not to rely on Narváez, but he did anyway, and he sent him to La Florida, the 3rd conquistador. Narváez landed with about 600 men in Tampa Bay. He had a good plan. He had a small army and some cavalry, and they were going to march straight up the coast of Florida on the west coast, right by the beaches, so they could look offshore and see a Spanish fleet sailing parallel. Great idea. Fleet just offshore, a land force marching north. What he didn't realize was West Florida was jungles, swamps, bayous, alligators, snakes, biting bugs, and hostile Indians. It was a disastrous trip. Narváez got as far north as Tallahassee, Florida, and I'm going to be using all modern names tonight. I won't try to go back and use all the old Indian names and Spanish names. Narváez got to Tallahassee, Florida, and he encountered a tribe called the Appalachians. The Appalachians defeated him in battle. So Narváez and his men fled to the jungles, the Gulf of Mexico, and there they had to escape this green hell they had landed in. So there were only 200 left out of 600. They built 5 large rafts, or brigantines, 5 rafts that would hold 50 men each. They began sailing across the Gulf of Mexico on their way to the Spanish colony in Mexico, 1,000 miles away. They probably hoped they would run into some Spanish ships that would rescue them. As they passed the Mississippi River, the current carried them out to sea, the winds carried them out to sea. Narváez was never seen again. A few of the Spaniards shipwrecked in Texas. One of them was this man on the right. His name is De Vaca. So there were, the Indians massacred most of the Spaniards, but they enslaved a few of these survivors from the Narváez expedition in Texas. They were slaves in Texas. 4 of them decided to escape. Anything was better than the slavery they were enduring, so they wandered off, and this man is named De Vaca. If you have time, you ought to read about his story. It's an amazing story. These 4 Spaniards wandered on foot, unarmed, from Texas all the way to the Gulf of California and then down into Mexico. And he wandered out to and found his countrymen in New Spain, which was Mexico. Now, the reason I mentioned, there's 3 reasons I wanted to tell you about De Vaca. Fascinating exploit, amazing journey, thousands of miles across the southwestern United States on foot. Secondly, he became a champion of Indians' rights. He deplored the exploitation of Indians by Spanish colonists, and he paid for that later in his life. But the third reason I wanted to mention De Vaca is when he wandered out of the wilderness into the Spanish colony in Mexico, at exactly that time, Hernando de Soto was in Spain planning his entrada to La Florida. So de Soto learned from this man what Narváez had done wrong in La Florida. A great explorer has to have lucky breaks, and this is one of them. But when De Vaca came out, he had been, I think, 11 years in the wilderness by the time he finally came out. So, now we finally get to De Soto. Hernando de Soto. He was a lower level aristocrat, the Hidalgo class, in Spain. A lot of great overachievers in history are kind of low-level aristocrats who don't have great titles and they don't have a lot of money. Perhaps they're a younger son, the older son inherits the titles. He was well educated, an aristocrat, so he knew how to get around the powerful people. As a child in Spain, he would have read about and heard about the exploits of Cortez conquering the Aztecs, those cannibals with all that gold in Mexico. He would have dreamed of being a conquistador like Cortez. So when he was 18 years old, with no money, well educated but no money, no titles, he headed for the New World. He joined a group of 1,500 Spaniards. They went to Panama. 500 of them were dead within 6 months. Hunger, fevers, disease. He survived. In his 20s, by the time he was in his 20s, he became essentially a millionaire. He owned thousands of acres in Central America. He owned many, many slaves, Indian slaves. He and some partners bought ships. Now those ships traded merchandise among the Spanish colonies. Some of the merchandise were Indian slaves. So in his 20s, he undoubtedly traded in these Indian slaves and asked them where they came from, what is your country like? I'm sure a lot of these Indian slaves that he encountered came from La Florida, North America. So in his 20s, he's already rich and a great adventurer. He's enormously charismatic, a leader of men, even at that age. Now, in his 30s, a conquistador named Pizarro organized a force to go down to Peru to conquer the Incas. This rich young man joined Pizarro. He raised a cavalry regiment with his own money. He took his regiment on his own ships down to Peru, and he was Pizarro's cavalry commander in Peru, conquering the Incas at about age 35 or so. Don't have time to talk about the amazing exploits as a cavalry officer in Peru. He was just a shining light among the Spaniards in the conquest of the Incas. They collapsed the Inca Empire, and you've heard the stories about how Pizarro took the king of the Incas hostage and said, you have to fill up this room with gold to the ceiling, and I'll let your king go. The Incas filled the room with gold. He killed the king. Now, when all that was finished, Pizarro, the conquistador, gave the 20% to the king. The conquistador always gave 20% to the king. The other 80% of all that gold was divided among Pizarro and his men. Officers like De Soto got a large share. As a cavalry commander for Pizarro, he became a billionaire at the age of 40. De Soto did. He went back to Spain, essentially a billionaire. He married a very, very wealthy woman who doubled his fortune. One note about that, her father was a conquistador named Pedrarius. He was a very cruel, sadistic conquistador in Nicaragua and Central America. Pedrarius was. His nickname, El Domini Furor. El Domini Furor, the wrath of God. Now, when you got a nickname like that, you're a bad dude. That was De Soto's father-in-law. So there he is, age 40. He's back in Spain. He's a billionaire. The king of Spain commissioned him as a conquistador and sent him to conquer North America, La Florida. He's the fourth conquistador. The other three all died. They all died trying. He was sent by the king. Now, it's important just to think about that for a moment. A lot of people want to view, because of the violence in that age, and especially that expedition, they want to view him as sort of just a sadistic thug whose only thought in life was greed for gold. This guy didn't need gold. He was a billionaire. Now, the 700 Spaniards and Portuguese he brought with him, a lot of them lusted for gold, but this man was on a mission. He was sent by the king to create a Spanish nation. He was going to be the father of a Spanish nation, just like Venezuela or Mexico, and we would all be speaking Spanish. He was serving God and King. He took priests with him so that they could convert the Indians to Christianity. So in 1739, he begins planning his expedition. Now, the King of Spain did something really smart. He made De Soto the governor of Cuba, a very prosperous Spanish colony. He was also the governor of North America. Whatever he could conquer or settle and claim for Spain would be his province as the governor of La Florida. Had he succeeded, he would have been the governor of a United States territory that stretched from the Florida Keys all the way to Texas. He would have been the governor of that vast empire, probably as big as Spain, and also the governor of Cuba. That was important because many colonies failed because they were not supported by the home country. Well, as governor of Cuba, he could send support to the colonies in La Florida. So what I'm trying to say is these colonies he was going to establish had a very good chance of success because he could support them as governor of Cuba. So he launched his expedition and he landed in Tampa Bay. Now, a good explorer has to be lucky. And Lewis and Clark got lucky. They had an interpreter, Sacagawea, who guided them through the Rockies. Her tribe lived in the Rockies. De Soto got very lucky. He lands in Tampa Bay, and he almost immediately encounters a Spaniard who had been marooned in Florida for 10 years. This Spaniard's name was Juan Ortiz. Juan Ortiz. He became De Soto's interpreter. Now, one of the things that's amazing about that period of time as De Soto moved through the country, how many different Indian languages there were. It's astonishing. De Soto would travel 50 miles and it would be 2 different languages. So Juan Ortiz organized a platoon of Indian interpreters. Each territory they went to, they would capture a new Indian to become an interpreter, and this group of interpreters headed by Juan Ortiz would relay messages to De Soto, and De Soto was able to get his message across. De Soto would travel 4,000 miles in 4 years, and Juan Ortiz was a big part of the success story. So they land in Tampa Bay, and they begin marching north up through the Florida Peninsula. Now, immediately there was immediate hostility, just like there had been with the previous Conquistador Narváez. The Indians of Florida were sick and tired of Europeans dragging them off in chains. They were ambushed day and night as they moved up through Florida. Now, De Soto had this amazing opportunity. He saw the Mississippian culture in full flower. The Native Americans at that time had developed the most advanced and wealthy and populous culture of all time in North America. It's known as the Mississippians. The Mississippians consisted of little provinces or chiefdoms. Each chiefdom had a capital city, so to speak, ruled by a paramount chief. There were satellite cities or towns. All of the main towns, the capital town and the satellite towns, were all well fortified. Many of them had moats, water moats that protected the city. In the capital city where the paramount chiefs lived, they collected all of the corn and beans and crops. The Mississippians were great farmers. De Soto soon learned this. This is where the food was. The paramount chief brought in all the surplus crops, stored them through the fall and winter, and doled them out to his different villages and towns. They all pretty much looked like this. Populations were typically 1,000 to 5,000 Indians. They had sturdy wooden houses, very nice houses. In fact, the Spaniards always moved into those houses and never complained in the chronicles about leaky roofs. The Mississippian culture spread from the Atlantic all the way to Arkansas. It spread north up the Ohio and the Mississippi. Now, in southwestern Arkansas was a Mississippian culture that was a little different, the Caddos. And the Spaniards had encountered the Caddos. But so throughout this huge region, 4,000-mile journey that De Soto took, he came to many, many of these different chiefdoms. And one thing that's surprising about it, about these chiefdoms, is they were often separated by uninhabited spaces. I think because they were often at war, that Indians often grouped together in their fortified towns. And on one occasion, De Soto traveled about 150 or 200 miles through Georgia and didn't see, there were no villages, no Indians at all. So these were very much concentrated, centralized population centers. Now, it's very important that you understand this about De Soto. This was a horde of people and animals that had to be fed. De Soto had about 700 Spaniards and Portuguese. Some of them, there were a few women, there were a few wives. Some of them were slaves and servants. So there were 700 essentially Spaniards that had to be fed. There were 240 horses that had to be fed. The horses could not graze on the grasses and in the forests of North America. For one thing, the Indians would have killed grazing horses. So 700 men, more or less, 240 horses, a number of war dogs. There were always 500 to 1,000 Indian porters and slaves. De Soto brought a herd of pigs. He probably started with a couple of dozen pigs. He brought the pigs to be a food source for emergencies. The pigs could follow the entrada and be eaten in case of emergency. De Soto would not let anybody eat his pigs. Many nights the Spaniards went to bed hungry and wanted to eat De Soto's pigs, but he would not allow it. At the end of 4 years in Arkansas, his herd of pigs was 700 pigs. Now, think about this. 700 Spaniards, 240 horses, 700 pigs, and 1,000 Indian slaves and porters, and several dozen or scores of war dogs. That's a huge group of people and animals that has to be fed. They had, and where did they get the food? From the Indian towns. You have to understand that. So constantly, for 4 years, 4,000 miles, De Soto is looking for the big towns. Why? That's where the food is. He has to feed this horde of people. This need to feed this huge horde inevitably led to a lot of the violence that occurred. The porters, it was a pitiful lot. They were often in chains. We don't know whether, many times he demanded porters in one town. We don't know if he released some of the porters when he got to the next town or if he simply worked them to death. We aren't sure, but everywhere he went, he needed porters. 200, 400, 600 porters were his standard demands as he entered a new territory. There was a great deal of fighting. The Indians did not want to negotiate most of the time, and these Spaniards were possibly the world's finest soldiers in the 16th century. The Indians fought with mainly bow and arrow, clubs and lances, but the Indians' bow and arrow, the Spaniards wrote many, many pages amazed at how powerful and accurate and rapid firing the Indian arrows were. I can't go into details, but it's just amazing how the velocity and power of those Indian arrows and how rapidly they could fire them. Now, magnificent soldiers, the Spaniards, they really were never defeated except on one occasion, really. Now, the Spaniards did not win with guns. They didn't bring cannons, they were too heavy. Arquebus muskets were useless as weapons. The arquebus muskets were mainly used to show off and make smoke and noise to impress the chief. when he visited a new town. So the Spaniards fought with medieval weapons. The infantry, their primary weapon was a sword and shield. But they won so many battles. Well, one is because they fought in the European style of coordinated men fighting together, where the Indians fought individualistically. But the real reason they won so many battles was the horse. These horsemen have swords, but the key cavalry weapon was the horse with a long lance. And the Indians could not stand up to horses. And so the Indians always wanted to attack De Soto out in the swamps and ambush him on the narrow trails in the forest. The Spaniards always wanted the battle to be in a clearing. And there were a lot of clearings to fight in because the Mississippian Indians cleared for crops. There were plenty of space for the Spanish to use their cavalry. The horses had padded armor. The horses were Barbary, barb horses, Barbaries, bred in North Africa by Arabs. Powerful horses, barbs, enormous stamina and strength, and great war horses, totally fearless. And the Spaniards were amazed how many times these horses could be wounded and still carry their rider loyally. The Spanish horses were a tremendous advantage in war with the Indians. Horses had padded armor, and they had dozens of these little bells called Clarksdale bells. The horses were hung with bells so that when the cavalry charged the Indians, these jingling bells made a tremendous racket. That was the last sound a lot of the Indian warriors heard as the Spanish cavalry advanced with these Clarksdale bells. War dogs. Spanish were great soldiers. They bred 3 or 4 different species of ferocious killer dogs that they used in battle. As the 4 years went on, most of those dogs were killed, though. The Indians, by the way, the Indians preferred to kill a horse than a Spaniard because they feared the horses so much. So Indians would celebrate the death of a horse more than the death of a Spaniard. The dogs were ferocious. Everywhere he went, De Soto needed a guide. He needed a guide to tell him where to cross the river, where the next big town with food was. And the standard rule for an Indian guide was, if you lead us off track, which they did a lot, lead us astray, we'll feed you to the dogs. It was a cruel world, 16th century. And a lot of those Indians, knowing what would happen, deliberately guided De Soto into swamps and off the track, knowing that they were going to die in this manner. In fact, on one occasion, De Soto had 4 Indians. He demanded that they tell him where their town was. They all 4 refused. He said, I'm going to burn you to death if you don't tell me where your town is. One by one, he burned those 4 Indians to death. Not one of them would divulge. Now, those are brave men. Loyal, brave men. So this is kind of a military, it's a military expedition, but De Soto, as I said earlier, he's not really the thug, I think, that we make him out to be in the 21st century, notwithstanding that kind of violence. The 16th century was terribly violent. In Europe, the Reformation was underway. Protestants were being burned at the stake in Europe. The Spanish Inquisition was underway. Jews were being tortured in Spain. It was a cruel world all over the world. I'm not making apologies or excuses for De Soto. I'm just telling you, like it was, the 16th century was a bad time to be alive, and there was a lot of violence. Spaniards weren't just cruel to Indians. Some French Huguenots, trying to escape religious persecution in France, founded a colony in Jacksonville, Florida. Spanish went in and killed every one of them And the Spanish officer wasn't embarrassed. He was proud of what he had done. It was a cruel world. De Soto was a Machiavellian. He did not use violence because he was some kind of sadist. He preferred to use charm and diplomacy. He preferred to give gifts and make alliances with the chiefs, but he would use violence when he had to. Now, and remember this, De Soto was on a mission for the king. He went all through what is now the southeastern United States, 4,000 miles, essentially telling these chiefs, you are Spanish subjects. We serve the king in Spain, and you serve me, the governor of La Florida. So, in doing that, he gave trade goods, he formed alliances with these chiefs, and he, as I said, used his charm and diplomacy, and he preferred not to use violence. He was going to be the governor of these people. This is a horrible incident that occurred in Arkansas. There are only two incidents like this where Indians' hands were cut off. This was a punishment for betrayal. In Arkansas, De Soto formed an alliance with a tribe. The tribe decided to betray De Soto and assassinate him, and they had a plot against De Soto. De Soto learned about it from an informant. And so he turned the tables on the plotters, his Indian allies who were going to kill him, and this was the punishment. He cut their hands off. Horrible, diabolical. But again, I'm not defending the guy, but there's a method to his madness. And you know, if you went back to Europe in 1540, you'd probably see some people without hands who were thieves. But there are only two of these incidents, both of which he was trying to send a message. The De Soto Chronicles are one of the most valuable and priceless historical documents in the world. There's 3 different journals by 3 different people. When you read them, one of them was an auditor sent by the King of Spain who wrote a very business-like report. And it's a wonderful insight into the Mississippian Indian culture of the town. The only disappointments are every single day they're talking about where are we going to get food. A lot of information about food and battles and these repetitive speeches that De Soto would make and that the chiefs would make. But we have incredible detail on how large these towns were. The biggest disappointment to me is that none of the chroniclers were priests. There were Catholic priests with De Soto. Priests wrote some wonderful historical accounts because they're interested in how people live and what they believe. But unfortunately, no priests or naturalists wrote chronicles. Can you imagine if one of them had been a naturalist describing these virgin forests that the Spanish encountered? So, in 1539, De Soto launches his entrada from Spain. In the first year, he spent marching up the coast of Florida. By the way, the word entrada, Spanish word, it means exploration with the intention of claiming territory and making a colony. So entrada is explore and claim territory. So for 5 months, De Soto marches through Florida, fighting, constantly being ambushed, fighting day and night. And he reaches Tallahassee. This is where Narváez was defeated by the Appalachians 11 years earlier. So De Soto gets there after 5 months in the Appalachian chiefdom. This time, he defeats the Appalachians and they flee. De Soto moves into their town, which is basically Tallahassee, and Hica. He moves into their town and he occupies it all winter. For 5 months he lives in Tallahassee, Florida, in this fortified Indian town with palisades. The Appalachians came out of the woods. They would attack any Spaniard that left the palisade, and for 5 months they huddled in that walled town. By the way, the Appalachian Mountains are named for the Appalachians. Why would they name mountains in the eastern United States after the Appalachians? Is because in Europe they were all reading about this tribe in Florida that defeated Narváez, that fought with De Soto. So that's how the Appalachians were named, for Indians of Tallahassee, Florida. So for 5 months he spends his first winter there in Tallahassee. 450 years, nobody ever knew where a De Soto campsite was until 1988. An archaeologist from Florida State University was driving through Tallahassee and he saw a construction site. He went to the developer and he said, "Can I dig in the dirt of your construction site?" This archaeologist is named Calvin Jones. He was an expert in Spanish colonial artifacts because he was looking for a Spanish mission 100 years after De Soto. In Tallahassee, in the 1600s, there was a Spanish mission. Calvin Jones wanted to find it. The real estate developer was wonderful. He said, "You can dig in my dirt, just don't get run over by a bulldozer." Calvin Jones starts digging in the dirt. 15 minutes. He's found dozens of Indian arrowheads and projectile points spanning thousands of years. He had found an ancient Indian town. He keeps digging. Within an hour, he had Spanish artifacts. He could not believe what he had found. He had found De Soto's winter camp. The first time in history archaeologists have found De Soto's camp. Now, there are many De Soto artifacts are known. They're in museums all over the South, but that doesn't mean De Soto was in that particular location. Calvin Jones found chain mail. He found, this was a dead giveaway. Cortez didn't use muskets. He used crossbows. That immediately told the archaeologists that this is a 16th century find, 1539, and not later. Crossbow bolts. This was very important. These are shards from olive jars. In the colonial period, colonists, England, France, the Dutch, Spanish, they all used olive jars to transport valuable goods. You could put oil, you could put wine, you could put gunpowder, you could put anything in an olive jar. Archaeologists love it because they can tell where it was made and when it was made based on the style. And olive shards sometimes have a maker's mark in the wet clay. These were dated to De Soto's time. The clincher, 4 coins. 4 Spanish coins were found with dates. Also, there were pig bones. De Soto had pigs, the Indians did not. And there were trade beads. These were the trade beads the Spaniards used. So that was the first time we ever knew and had in situ a De Soto site. And by the way, the second one is in Arkansas. Some years later, archaeologists have decided that Parkin State Park in Arkansas was a De Soto site. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so the first year of this 4-year entrada ends in Tallahassee, right here. So he spends 5 months here. And this, at that time, a decision was made that may have changed the course of history. The King of Spain expected De Soto to come 200 miles over here to Pensacola and build a colony. 200 miles. Could have done it in 2 weeks. Flat country. Spaniards could build a colony in 2 weeks. They've done it many times. It's easy to do when you enslave Indians, right? And when you move into the Indians' town, and when you take over cleared farming fields that the Indians use. So what I'm saying is that by June of that second year, De Soto could have very well established the colony of Pensacola. De Soto had given instructions for a fleet of Spanish ships to come up here to Pensacola and meet him in the summer of 1540. In the summer of 1540, De Soto could have, should have established the colony in Pensacola. Instead, he met an Indian boy named, they called him Perico, which is a nickname for Peter. He converted to Christianity. Perico was a godsend, according to De Soto. Perico, the teenage boy, had grown up in the Carolinas. He had traveled all over the southeast with a group of traders who traded among Indian tribes. So Perico knew the territory. He knew where all the towns were. Perico had been born and raised up here. As a trader among tribes, Perico could communicate with different tribes. De Soto was delighted to have Perico in the camp. We don't know why. Perico told the Spaniards they had gold up here. Perico knew the difference in gold and copper. Perico had seen Indians quarry copper and produced copper jewelry. He lied and said, and described the process as gold. De Soto was no fool, but they, based on Perico's advice, instead of founding the colony, they headed in the spring and summer up to South Carolina. Perhaps a fateful decision. In South Carolina, they came to a chiefdom called Cofetachequi, had a female chief. They spent several very happy weeks, probably the best weeks of the 4-year journey were spent there in South Carolina. These South Carolina Indians prized freshwater pearls. They had thousands and thousands of freshwater pearls, and they gave them to the Spaniards, anything to get rid of these guys, right? They even dug up the graves of their ancestors to get grave goods, the pearls. So De Soto collected thousands and thousands of freshwater pearls in South Carolina. Important for a couple of reasons. De Soto wanted to find gold or silver because that would make his colony successful. If he found gold or silver, Spaniards would flock to North America, as they had Mexico, Peru, and all those other countries. Again, De Soto didn't necessarily need to get rich, but he wanted something of value to bring colonists. He couldn't find gold or silver, so he took an enormous stash of freshwater pearls there in South Carolina. Now, one thing about freshwater pearls, before we polluted all our rivers, cut down all the forests, filled our streams with mud and silt, our streams were full of freshwater pearls and mussels. Here in Arkansas in the 1920s, there was a huge industry. People made money. Whole families would go out and collect pearl shells for the pearl button industry. All those mollusks, or mostly endangered species, are gone now because our rivers aren't clean like they used to. And these freshwater clams and mussels, they live 100 years. So if you over-harvest them in the Buffalo River or the White River, you destroy a whole species. So anyway, so De Soto found something he thought would be nice to attract colonists, and that was freshwater pearls. So they left South Carolina, and they headed up into the Blue Ridge Mountains looking for gold. They found none, of course, and nobody knows what happened to Perico. If he was smart, he would have run away. So in the second year, De Soto and his men are in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Smokies. The fall is in the air, it's turning cold, and now De Soto says, I got to go down to Pensacola and build my colony. So he heads south through a powerful kingdom called Coosa. He's heading southwest. He's heading down to Pensacola now in his second year. He takes the chief and the chief's family members hostage for safekeeping. This is a powerful kingdom. And he carries his hostages, the chief, down here to Alabama. In Alabama, he met a chief named Tuscaloosa, a giant man named Tuscaloosa, a powerful chief. Tuscaloosa saw how De Soto had humiliated the rival chief from Coosa, and Tuscaloosa decided he's not going to do that to me. Tuscaloosa pretended to be friendly and form an alliance, but he intended to kill or capture these Spaniards. De Soto made his usual demands, and of course he gave gifts and formed an alliance and told Tuscaloosa all the wonderful things that Spanish citizenship would bring. Give me 400 porters, including a bunch of women, and I need a huge amount of food. Tuscaloosa said, okay, I'll give you everything you want, but it's a day journey to my other town, which is called Mobila. We'll have to go down to Mobila to get your food and your porters. So De Soto takes Tuscaloosa with him, as he usually does for safekeeping. He goes down to the town of Mobila. The Spanish were stretched out for 2 miles on the trail. The Spanish officers and Tuscaloosa went into the fortified city with the enlisted men and the cavalry back there on the trail. They're inside the fortified city. In come their porters with all of their baggage. De Soto began to suspect a trick. He looked around, and there were no children, there were no old people. There were only beautiful women dancing for the Spaniards. Suspicious. Tuscaloosa was watching him, watching De Soto's eyes. At that moment, they slammed shut the gates to this fortified city, and a huge battle broke out. De Soto was terribly outnumbered. It was just him and his officers versus hundreds and hundreds of warriors came out of these houses. It was like a Hollywood movie. De Soto and his officers fighting their way out with their swords, just like a Hollywood script. De Soto somehow escapes, and now he's outside the city, the fortified town of Mobila. Now, De Soto could have called it quits. His baggage is inside. In fact, the Indians are up on the Palisades with his baggage, mocking, taunting, throwing the Spaniards' goods in the air. Now, De Soto could have called it quits and headed down to Pensacola. It was only 140 miles away. De Soto knew his fleet was waiting at Pensacola. He knew that because the Indians told him. There's Spanish ships at Pensacola. He did not head for Pensacola. Instead, the Spaniards attacked that town. He was going to be the governor of La Florida. He was not going to be defeated by an Alabama Indian chief. The Spaniards built ladders, climbed over the walls. It was a brutal hand-to-hand combat inside the burning city. The Spaniards killed every single Indian in there. The Spaniards suffered huge losses. 102 Spaniards were killed out of 700. Many Spaniards were wounded, and their baggage, most of their baggage burned up, including the pearls. The only thing of value that they had to show to attract colonists had been burned up, the pearls. Now, at that point, he really should have headed down to Pensacola, where the fleet was waiting. He made a fateful decision. He decided not to go to Pensacola. He knew what would happen. If he took his men to Pensacola, most of them would desert him and get on those ships and leave. Moreover, the word would get back to Spain that De Soto had messed it up, that he was a loser, that he was a failure. He had seen that happen to Columbus. He was not going to take his men to Pensacola where the fleet was waiting. Instead, he turned northwest into Mississippi, heading west. Fateful decision. That winter, De Soto spent in Mississippi, northern Mississippi, near Tupelo or Columbus, with the Chickasaw Indians. He moved in, like he always did, he moved into their town, made himself at home. Now, on the last night, when the spring came, on the last night before the Spaniards were to leave, the Chickasaws invaded, launched a surprise attack. Each Chickasaw warrior had 2 ropes. One was to put around the neck of a Spaniard, and the other was to put around the neck of a pig. The Chickasaws had been stealing and eating De Soto's pigs, and he had to cut off a few hands. The Chickasaws launched a surprise attack, and they should have totally annihilated the De Soto Entrada, but he had 2 lucky breaks. First of all, it was in the middle of the night. Spaniards came out of their burning huts, naked, half naked. The Chickasaws were killing them right and left, but the horses stampeded. Indians were terrified of the horses. The Indians thought it was a cavalry attack, so they fled the village. By the time the Indians regrouped and made a second attack, it began raining. The rain made their bowstrings ineffective. So those 2 lucky breaks allowed the Spaniards to survive the Chickasaws. Otherwise, nobody would have ever known what happened to the De Soto expedition. They continued west through Mississippi and reached the Mississippi River. They spent several weeks there on the Mississippi banks on the other side of the river building rafts. Every day from Arkansas, Indian war canoes would come, threaten them, shoot arrows, taunt them, invite them to battle. The Arkansas Indians, they had dugout canoes made of cypress trees. These canoes were so big, you could put 80 warriors in a canoe. 80. With some of the warriors standing up, firing arrows while standing up. Huge war canoes. De Soto wasn't that interested in the war canoes. He was looking at the current in the river and figuring out what time in the morning those Indian warriors came down to the riverbank. So when the rafts were finished, before dawn, the Spaniards crossed into Arkansas. Once in Arkansas, the Arkansas Indians' attitude completely changed from hostility to hospitality. De Soto marched about a day's march to what we now know as Parkin State Park. The town was named Casquille. The Indian chief had learned enough about the Spanish to know that he better be hospitable, and those Indians converted to Christianity. There was a big ceremony, and De Soto and his men erected a huge cypress cross on the top of the largest Indian mound. Thousands and thousands of Indians watched the ceremony, and archaeologists have found the base of that cypress cross maybe 20 years ago, and that's how they know that Parkin is Casquille in the De Soto days. And by the way, these were the richest Mississippian towns that De Soto would encounter. They were so populated, the Spaniards in Parkin or Casquille, they could look out across the fields and they would see 4 or 5 other Indian towns. So these chiefdoms, like I said, had satellite towns, fortified towns. De Soto formed an alliance with the chief, as he often did. He said, look, you serve me and I'll help you defeat your enemies. They had enemies to the north at a chiefdom called Takaha, a large city with a protective moat and the usual palisade wall. And by the way, the moat was full of fish and shellfish and turtles, so this typical Mississippian town, the moat was used for transportation, but also fishing. There were weirs and nets to capture fish, typical Mississippian town. So De Soto and his allies attacked Pakaha, and the Pakaha Indians fled, and they went inside the temple, the Indian temple, and inside the temple were human heads hanging up on the walls. Now, Indians, the Mississippians, like to tattoo their faces, and they had distinctive earrings for their ears, and so the De Soto's Indian allies recognized the heads of their friends and their neighbors from parking. So what they did was they took down the heads of their friends to take them home for a proper burial, and they beheaded the Pakaha captives and put their heads in their places. Like I said, 16th century was a cruel world. This is all, of course, in the Mississippi Delta, northeast Arkansas, around West Memphis. That summer, and this is the third year, so De Soto left the Mississippi Delta and he headed up probably to the boot heel of Missouri. He actually left the Mississippian culture because up here he encountered Indians that lived in tents, movable, portable tents, woodland Indians. They didn't farm, they went west for bison. So now he's crossed from the Mississippian culture into the woodland culture, probably Boot Hill of Missouri. Then De Soto and his men came south to Colagua, Batesville, Arkansas, a very big Indian town in Batesville, Arkansas. When he was there, he saw that those Indians in Batesville, they had no gold. He looked up and he saw the Ozark Mountains, and he said, "What's up there?" And they pointed at the Ozarks and they said, "Nobody lives up there. It's cold, there's hardly anybody lives there, and there's certainly no gold." And De Soto knew there's no gold. They could pan for gold in the creeks. So they spent a few days in Batesville, and then they headed down basically to the Arkansas River where Conway is. They probably passed through Heber Springs, Arkansas. The De Soto chronicles say that when they left Batesville, I'm using modern names again, they left Batesville, headed down to Heber Springs, they passed through mountains. Now some people interpret that as they went up into the Ozarks. No, they didn't. If you've ever been to Heber Springs, they have mountains there. That's probably what he was talking about. There's no reason that De Soto would have gone in the Ozarks. He knew there's no gold, there's no food. Remember, he has 2,000 animals and people to feed, and he knows there's no big towns in the Ozarks. Some of you may, I don't know if you recognize this map. I know it's kind of hard to read. This map was in the library here last summer. It's a famous map from 1927, I believe, by a man named Sam Leith. This is the state of Arkansas. It shows old Indian trails, the military road here in Baxter County. You can find it here. It's an old Indian trail. Sam Leith thought De Soto sent an expedition through the Ozarks. Don't think so. No, he didn't. And Sam Leith was an accomplished amateur historian, but he was also president of the Chamber of Commerce of Eureka Springs. And so there was a great deal of interest in De Soto at that time. So anyway, I do not believe De Soto came through Arkansas. But he came down to the Arkansas River. He moved west almost to Fort Smith, had a huge battle with Indians, probably Caddos, and he defeated those Caddos, but they didn't have much food, and he turned back east, and he headed down to eastern Arkansas, probably near Fort Pine Bluff, for his third winter camp. It was at that third winter camp that the expedition began to run into trouble. Juan Ortiz, the interpreter, died. A terrible blow. Once Juan Ortiz was gone, even though they had Indian interpreters, it was never the same once their Spanish interpreter was dead. Now, De Soto, later that winter, De Soto died in Arkansas, somewhere near the Mississippi River. And they buried him inside the town, and they tried to keep it a secret, but the Indians quickly figured out De Soto was dead. They buried him, and then they dug him up, and they took De Soto out in the Mississippi River, weighted his body down at night, trying to keep it a secret, and sank De Soto's body in the Mississippi River. The Mississippian Indians had a practice called retainer sacrifice. When a powerful man died, they would sacrifice some living people to accompany him to the next world. Practice. Egypt, a lot of different cultures have done that. They offered retainer sacrifices for De Soto, but his men, being good Christians, said no thank you. So De Soto's dead, and his men are there wondering what they're going to do next. They thought, should we float down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico? They decided instead they headed west, like Devaka, the wandering holy man I told you about. He had, after all, wandered from Texas all the way to Mexico. So the Spaniards thought they could walk through Texas down to Mexico. And they went probably as far as Dallas or Austin, Texas. But those Indians, and now they had entered the Caddo culture and an impoverished woodland culture, and there was no food. It was, they were going to starve to death in Texas. So they turned back, all the way back, and they went back to Arkansas in the end of the 4th year. They spent the winter in Arkansas. They built huge rafts to float down the Mississippi River, which they did. When the spring came, they said goodbye to their hoarders and slaves. And believe it or not, there was a great deal of weeping and wailing. Life is strange. The relationship between slaves and slave owners, and some of the Spaniards had married and had children with Indian wives. And so those Spaniards said goodbye to 500 or 1,000 Indians left on the bank of the Mississippi, weeping as the Spaniards sailed down the Mississippi River. They were pursued for hundreds of miles by a warlike chief from Mississippi. They had to fight their way all the way down the Mississippi River. It took them, I think, 3 or 4 weeks to get to the Gulf. Once in the Gulf, they made an amazing trip through the Gulf down to the Mexican colonies in the Spanish colonies in Mexico and rescue. Now, in closing, De Soto was the 4th of 7 conquistadors. Number 5 was Coronado, Mexico into Arizona, New Mexico. He's the one who lost some horses on the Great Plains. The horses propagated. You know that story. De Soto and Coronado were actually only 300 miles apart. They didn't know each other were there, but when De Soto was near Fort Smith, Coronado was up in Kansas. Coronado survived. Coronado did not take pigs with him. He took sheep, but sheep don't multiply like the 700 of De Soto's pigs. After Coronado and De Soto, there were 2 other conquistadors. The last 2, one of them tried to found that Pensacola colony. It failed. A hurricane smashed the Pensacola colony that De Soto had intended to form. And the last conquistador, the last 2 conquistadors, they followed De Soto's footsteps in the eastern part of his trip. They visited the very same towns. Now, one of the questions people always ask is, did De Soto spread diseases? The answer is no. And we know that, first of all, anthropologists have looked for evidence and found none, but we know that he did not because the last two conquistadors went to the same villages De Soto visited in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, met some of the same Indians that De Soto had known. But the last conquistador, Juan Pardo, he built 5 Spanish forts in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the same towns De Soto visited. He built 5 forts, he left Spanish garrisons, and then he went to his colony in South Carolina, and the Indians massacred all of those Spaniards. And thus ended the king's plan to make La Florida a Spanish nation. Now, the Catholic priests, they were not after gold, they wanted souls. Spanish priests formed a string of missions from Florida all the way through Texas, all the way to California. San Juan Capistrano, the Alamo was a Spanish mission. So the king gave up on making a country, but those Catholic priests tried to convert the Indians. And very few Spaniards ever came and settled. Some did in California. But today, the only trace of the Spanish plans are a few Spanish names and some adobe missions in California or Texas. In closing, a Latin American diplomat once lectured at a university in the United States, and one of the students raised their hand and they said, "Sir, why is North America so prosperous? We have stable politics, we have the highest standard of living in the whole world, and Latin America, same size, lots of raw materials. Why is Latin America at that time impoverished, political instability, dictators, political coups? Why the difference?" And that Latin America diplomat, he said, "Your country was settled by men and women seeking political freedom and religious freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He said, "My continent was settled by men seeking gold." Now, and that is why the Spanish failed, I think, in North America. In closing, if you're interested, and we may have a few minutes, if you're interested in reading more, there's some excellent books. I actually brought a few excellent books about not only De Soto, but the other conquistadors. That period, Spanish period, is a fascinating time of history that we really don't know a whole lot about. They don't teach you that much about it in school, do they? So anyway, hope you've enjoyed that. Oh, the other question, and I'll take as many questions as we have time. The other question that comes up a lot was the 700 pigs. Did they escape and breed and become razorbacks?
Yeah.
No.
No.
You can read thousands and thousands of pages written by pioneers and colonists. There were no pigs running around. First of all, those Indians would have killed those pigs and eaten them right away. So no, De Soto's pigs, we don't know what happened to them, but they did not propagate. Other questions? Yes, Miriam.
How did he die?
Oh, how did De Soto die?
Yeah.
He died of some kind of disease
Oh.
that he had in Arkansas, his 2 years in Arkansas. He knew he was dying, and he wrote out his will and his instructions. And we don't know what that disease was, but he was in Arkansas 2 years. They spent more time in Arkansas than anywhere else. His men, 4,000 miles, an incredible journey from Tampa Bay all the way to Arkansas, down the Mississippi, into Mexico. And amazing explorers. It's just a shame that there was so much violence. A great explorer he was, but the violence really has tarnished his reputation.
How old was he?
De Soto, when he died, nobody knows exactly his date of birth. He was probably about 44 years old when he died. He had a wife, a Spanish wife, but he was a newlywed. His only two children were two daughters of Indian mistresses from South America, so he did not have any sons, and his Spanish wife was a widow. 1539, 1543, almost 500 years ago, sir.
Who inherited his fortune then?
His wife, and he also left a sizable legacy to cousins and church and back in Spain. But his wife was back in Havana, Cuba, because he was the governor of Cuba. So she got all that money, and she, as I said, she was filthy rich herself. Anything else? Well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed that.